So what I would like to talk to you about today, or who I would like to talk to you about today, is my family and my aunt, Nancy. My aunt was 14 years old when I was born. She was the youngest of 7 children. My grandfather was an alcoholic, which was a secret that I think people still don't really talk about. He fought in World War II and came back a changed person and not really the same person that he left. And my grandmother worked in a grocery store and supported her family, the 7 kids. My mom was the oldest of those 7 and basically raised the youngest kids while my grandmother was at work. My Aunt Nancy was fearless. She was the youngest in all the ways. Youngest people are the youngest in their family. She was the center of attention. She was this tiny, scrappy girl with blonde hair and blue eyes and freckled face, and always the center of attention, the life of the party, wild and crazy, fierce, a good aunt to have. And their house was probably not a great house to grow up in, and kind of probably a scary house in some ways. And my mom got married when she was 18 and left and got out of that environment. And my aunt would always tell my mom that she was abandoned, that she was left to fend for herself, essentially. And so at the age of 16, my aunt got pregnant, and she married her boyfriend, and they had 2 kids in a very short order. But it was an abusive relationship, and so by the age of 20, she was back living with my grandmother with her 2 kids, a high school dropout, really at a low point in her life. And at that point, in the years after that, it really became kind of a rags to riches story. She got her own business. She started to become really successful in the real estate business despite never having finished high school. She got married. They had a really kind of high-rolling lifestyle with boats and Porsches, and she was the kind of aunt that she'd always slip you like a $20 bill in your back pocket and even though your parents were like, no, don't take that, and it was always just the fun aunt to be around. She was very funny. She'd always make fun of my big feet, even though they're not really that big, but I was convinced that I have the largest feet in the world for a really long time. But despite, I think one of the things that I really got from her was that after her first marriage and that abusive situation, even though she remarried and they were very successful, she was very independent and determined that she was going to have her own money and have her own success and wasn't going to rely on anybody else. And from the outside world, that seemed very like she had it all, like she really had it made. And of course, there were cracks, there were glimpses of what was going on underneath, and it took me years to realize that probably part of the reason she was the life of the party at every holiday was that she was drunk the whole time, but didn't really realize that for a long time. But so there was a divorce, and there was selling off property, and there started to be hints of financial problems. But it didn't really come home that there was a really serious problem until my 4th year of medical school. And I was studying for boards, and I get a call from my mother that my aunt is in the hospital with intestinal bleeding and liver failure. And by the way, she's an alcoholic. And by the way, she's bankrupt. And by the way, she has all these legal problems. And that was all one conversation. So it was a little overwhelming. But one of the reasons she called is because I'm in medical school, so I should know what to do about this. And so I did what all doctors do. I Googled. True. And that didn't really come up with much. And I emailed one of the psychiatry professors who had given us a lecture on addiction. And throughout medical school, we had one lecture on addiction. That was it, one. And so I emailed him asking what resources there were and thinking that he was going to send me this long list of all these options. And it turns out if you don't have insurance and you don't have money, there really aren't many options. And the options there were had very long waiting lists. And so there just wasn't a lot we could do. But we were able to, or my aunt was able to sell some things and get some people to borrow money, and we found a place where she could go. And it was a 30-day treatment program, and it cost $11,000. And she was going to go for 30 days, and then she was going to be clean, and then she was going to be well, and everything was going to be good. And she was going to get back on the right track, and she was going to get a liver transplant, and everyone was going to be happy. And so she and my grandmother and her sisters drove down on the way to this place, and they stopped to visit me here in Nashville on the way, and we went to the Loveless Cafe, because that's, I guess, where you go before you go to rehab, the Loveless Cafe, I don't know. And my aunt orders a glass of wine. My Aunt Nancy, the one who's going to rehab, and we're all like, why are you ordering a glass of wine? And nobody else got anything to drink. It was very awkward. And she had several glasses of wine, and I don't know why that struck me as odd at the time. Of course, that's what she would want. But she went to rehab, and she finished the program, and it was very hard. There were lots of tearful phone calls and pleading and bargaining and lots of kind of drama around that. But she finished it, and we were all very optimistic that that was the end of that. Like, we were done with that, and now everything can be good. And she moved back in with my grandmother, and of course, she's still very sick because she needs a liver and is medically disabled now because of all this. But it seems like we're on the right path. Like, it seems like things are gonna at least plateau to a place of safety. But of course they don't. And we think that she's still clean, but there's all sorts of money borrowing, and everyone feels resentment, and everyone's frustrated, and why are you living with my 85-year-old grandmother when, like, you're an adult and you need to be, why is she taking care of you? And of course she has kids of her own who want her to be their mom and their kids' grandkids, and so I went to residency to be an OBGYN, and my third year in residency, I get another call. And this call is that Nancy is aspirated, so choked on her own vomit, and is in the hospital in the intensive care unit, and they're taking her off life support. And she's 52 years old, and it's way too young to die. And so of course, and then we find out later her car is full of vodka bottles, because it's really easy to hide drinking vodka, and so we didn't really know that she had relapsed a while ago. Of course, a loss like that, a death like that, shouldn't happen and has repercussions that are really big and really large, and some of which I can't even talk about to this day. But one of the things I think about a lot is that she was not able to get the treatment that she needed for as long as she needed. And that affects the work that I do. Around the time of her death, when I was a resident, we started to see more pregnant women coming to the emergency room in withdrawal from opiate addiction. And what I was finding is that sometimes we would be able to admit these patients, sometimes there would be beds for them, sometimes there weren't. When they could be admitted and stabilized, they would get discharged, and then there was often nowhere for them to follow up. They would get discharged without really any good resources, and they would come back 2 weeks later, same scenario, repeating over again. And seeing as a resident, you're often the first person who goes down into the emergency room to talk to the patient before the attending talks to them. And you're often the last person to see the patient to tell them what the plan is after the attending tells you what the plan is. So you're often the one that has to tell the patient, like, no, there are no resources, or no, we can't do anything, or we may be able to do something in 6 hours or 8 hours. And often that's just not good enough or fast enough. And so after having to have one of those conversations where the patient ended up leaving the hospital against medical advice, I was just really struck by how our system isn't really designed to take care of people when they need to be taken care of. And it can't wait. Like, when someone asks for help, they need help right then, not in 30 days or 60 days when someone else has a bed. When I have the privilege of working with women with addiction who are pregnant, I think about my aunt, and I think that she was an addict, but she was also a great aunt and a wonderful person, and she deserved treatment, and my patients deserve treatment, and no one asks to be an addict. No one wants that for themselves, and so we should just do better. That's it. Thank you.